So, good evening. It's Wednesday, and we are in our Lucan Bible study, where we look at passages from Luke from the lens of scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. Tonight, we're going to look at pieces of chapters 5 and 6, and our theme is lead, follow, or get in the way. So I'm going to just kind of summarize these two chapters, except read just a couple of pieces from them, because we're going to be looking at them, particularly what it means to be a disciple, an apostle, or to be in opposition to Jesus. So chapter 5 opens up with Jesus speaking to the crowds, and then he needs to be able to speak to more of them. So he gets in Simon Peter's boat and asks him to row out so he can talk. And then he tells Simon Peter to drop his net over, which Peter's not super excited about because they've already cleaned up from a whole night of unsuccessful fishing. But he does. They haul in this tremendous amount of fish. And Peter's response is to fall at Jesus' knees and say, "Leave me, Lord, for I'm a sinner." And then Jesus tells him not to be afraid. From now on, he'll be fishing for people. Then Jesus heals a man with a skin disease, heals the paralyzed man, which we talked about last week. And then he calls a tax collector. So, which this is from 5:27, 27 and 28. He says, "Afterward, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at a kiosk for collecting taxes. Jesus said to him, 'Follow me.' Levi got up, left everything behind, and followed him." And then some of the Pharisees and legal experts challenge him for calling a tax collector when asks, they grumble against his disciples. And Jesus responds saying he didn't come to call the righteous, but to call sinners. Then we have these passages about old and new, where you can't take a patch from a new garment to patch an old garment, and where you can't put new wine in old wineskins. And then we have several challenges against Jesus when his disciples do things on the Sabbath, like eat grain, or he heals a man's withered hand. And then at 6:12, we get this. "During that time, Jesus went out to the mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night long. At daybreak, he called together his disciples. He chose 12 of them, whom he called apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called a zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor." So, as I mentioned, the title of this week is Lead, Follow, or Get in the Way. When I was a little kid, my dad used to say to me all the time, "Lead, follow, or get out of the way," because I was constantly under his feet. But this, I've turned it a little bit to say what we have in this passage are either people who are leading with Jesus, people who will follow Jesus, or people who are getting in the way of Jesus. And it seems to me that those are three responses that we can make to Jesus still today. So let's look at each of these pieces. So Scripture, from a scripture perspective, we're trying to get a definition of what's the difference between a disciple and apostle, first of all. So disciples seem to be people who follow. That seems to be a key piece to what defines a disciple here. Now, and to some extent, they abandon the life that they've had. Now, the question is, when Jesus has this interaction with the fishermen, are they disciples yet? Because Peter's response to Jesus is to say, "Leave me, Lord." Now, he does call Jesus master a little bit before that, so perhaps he is following Jesus, or at least recognizing Jesus' authority, but there's a little bit of question as to whether he is following at this point or just afraid of what Jesus' life offers him. Now, Levi, on the other hand, does abandon and follow, but he also goes back to his home and has a party for Jesus there. So the level, he seems to have abandoned his career, but how much of abandonment of his life is another question as well. Now, then we are told later that 12 are chosen to be apostles, and they're chosen from among the disciples. Now, the question is, what's their role? We don't get much of a definition of their role here. Later on in Luke 9, 1-6, they're sent out with the authority over demons and to heal sickness. And that ties into the Greek word from which apostle comes, which the Greek verb is apostolo, which means to be sent out. that role then later becomes a little bit further distinguished as the governing authorities in the church. But my question is whether that's true to that initial defining of that role, because what Jesus tends to ask of his apostles is that they're sent out, like I said, to have authority over demons, to cast out demons, and to heal folks. And that seems to be central and distinct from just that role of being a disciple to follow. Okay, so let's think in terms of tradition and how these roles play out. First, I want to talk about the tradition of having headings in our Bible, which we have not always had. These little headings that you might see, those are not in the original biblical text. Those are things that editors of Bibles put in. So when my little heading here says Jesus calls disciples, it's interesting right there because that's when he's having that interaction with Simon Peter over the fish. But the word disciples not actually used in there at all, and they're not doing any following really in that point, as I mentioned. So it's interesting. Maybe disciples there, but maybe not. Maybe just people that are kind of trying to make the decision, and Jesus is urging them into that. But the question of whether they have taken that role on yet is still a little shaky. So I want you to be aware of that tradition in our Bible, to put those headings in and to bring those into question sometimes. But let's talk more about the tradition of these roles in the church. So everyone is a disciple. Everyone who chooses to follow Jesus is a disciple, but the apostles are appointed out to be sort of church professionals, is what they become. And as I mentioned, there's hints of that in Acts, happening in Acts. But it really takes hold as we start defining the hierarchy of the church. And so apostles tend to be those of us who are in professional ministry. And that is our distinction. And distinctions in roles are a good thing. And naming some folks as having that gift is a good thing. But when do they become stumbling blocks? When does the hierarchy become more important than the role and the purpose? And what do we do when we can't be sent out, which a lot of us are feeling not able to be sent out right now? So what happens to that role in those states? So I want to kind of think in those terms as well. I will say that there is a deep tradition of apostolic succession, which is this idea of Jesus laid his hand on those 12. Those 12 then laid their hands on the folks that came after them to order the church, and on and on and on. And I technically am in apostolic succession, although there's a challenge to that because Wesley wasn't a bishop whenever he laid hands on the folks that he ordained, but we still say we're in apostolic succession. But I'll acknowledge that the rest of the Christian community argues with us about that. But we say that we've had hands laid on, hands laid on, hands laid on, hands laid on. And that's an interesting battle of tradition. Again, asking the question, are we getting kind of caught up in the history at the cost of, reality? So the question around reason is, do these roles reflect the original meanings? And I think that the answer to that is yes and no. We all should follow Jesus, so only those that are in opposition to Jesus are not disciples. So if you're not in opposition to Jesus, if you're in some ways listening to what he has to say, then you're a disciple. That while there are some sacrifices that the disciples do make in here, as it said, Levi abandons. The key thing in there is to follow, and especially in when we compare it to the people that are actively opposing Jesus, disciples tend to be those who aren't. Now, apostles, like I said, tend to be set out for a particular ministry. To order the church comes later. Our primary role is to be sent out. And as I mentioned, we need to think, we need to reflect on how good it is to have distinctions in roles, but when do those distinctions become stumbling blocks? And as I said, right now we feel a little challenged about this role of being sent out. However, I want us to think a little bit creatively about these two roles and where we are right now. First of all, we can all still follow. We can spend this time of reflection and preparation. We can think about what it means to follow Jesus. We in some ways we've been asked to and required to abandon some things, And maybe there's some discipline in that, which is the same root word as disciple. And so maybe there's some time to stop and reflect on what this means and how this changes us as followers of Jesus, and how it shows us what's really important about our lives, so that when we move forward from here, we can live more fully into that discipleship that we're called into. And I also want us to think in terms of, since disciples are the ones that follow Jesus, and we are kind of contrasted with those who oppose Jesus, I want us to think about this new piece that happens in the middle of these passages, which is that you can't put old or new wine into old wineskins without bursting the wineskins, and how this time of preparation that we're all going through, this time of reflection, may lead to a new understanding of church, and that's scary and challenging, but also exciting, and has a lot of potential for how we can then be followers of Jesus in the 21st century, and what that means. So I think as the church is becoming something new, we as followers of Jesus have this time to reflect on what that newness means, and how we can put this new wine that we're experiencing into new wineskins as we come back together. But I also want to lift up the sending out that's happening, and that we have this exciting way of being apostles right now. And it's not necessarily limited to those of us that are the ordained clergy. I want to lift up all the people that are part of the effort to send out the word of the gospel right now. All of the folks that have gone online, that have done devotionals like this, that have shared their faith. Yes, pastors are absolutely leading out on this. We're front and center in many ways in taking the church online and out into the digital world that we're all experiencing right now. But we also have a ton of lay people that are helping with that effort as well. And that's the work of the apostles right now. The work of the apostles is this sending out, and this interacting with the world, beyond these sort of physical borders, but out into these virtual borders, these borders of the World Wide Web, these sort of unbound spaces. I hear stories of people in Pakistan watching churches in Arkansas, of us reaching people that didn't have this connection with church, now are having a connection with church because it's right there and present and speaking to the reality of their lives in a meaningful way. We're doing that sent out work right now. And I love that. I love that this role of the apostles, of being sent out to heal and to be present in people's lives and bring the freedom that Christ has for us into their lives, into that space. I don't want us to lose that reality. Yes, we have this time to reflect and be disciples and think about how we're going to follow, and think about how we put new wine into new wineskins and what that means. But also, we are doing the sent out work. And I want to celebrate that. And I'm thankful for all the folks that are getting up every week and thinking creatively about how they can deliver the message of God in new and powerful ways. This is a real opportunity for us to remember what it means to follow and to abandon, to put new into new, to get past these old boundaries, and to be sent out in a powerful way. We are, as I said, given three choices. We can lead, and that's what we're doing in the sending out. We can follow. We can reflect on what this means, to have abandoned some things to clear the way for Christ. Or we can get in the way. We can be so concerned about our own understanding, so focused in on what our own needs are, centered on things being the way they used to be, that we miss this opportunity. But I am personally grateful for this new opportunity to express my faith. And I'm so grateful for all of you who are choosing to lead and follow, and think about all the things we are getting out of the way for others reaching Jesus. Thank you so much for being with me tonight. Next week, I think we're going to talk about building our houses on sand. And so join me for the next one, and you will be in my prayers. Keep doing the sent out work. Keep being present in this new way, in these new lives that are being transformed for Jesus. Blessings.